So I think that we all have this very negative connotation to stress. And I think it's important that we learn to change our relationship to it because just like with anything else, it has its upsides and it has its downsides. And I would say primarily when it comes to the downsides, it's when we're not feeling like we have control, when we feel like it's something very negative, and when it is either chronic, which then turns into burnout, or it's something that is so debilitating or traumatic that it can be a very acute stressor. So I would say, while those things are true, I think the other side of the coin is the side that we don't talk about enough. And that's where stress can actually be enhancing. And I think really the reason why I wrote this book is to highlight the other side of this coin.
Welcome to Linda's Corner, where we bring more hope, healing, and happiness to the world. My name is Linda Bjork, and today we're going to be talking about managing stress and burnout. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sharon Grossman. Dr. Sharon is a psychologist, coach, international keynote speaker, podcast host, best-selling author, and the founder of the Warrior Institute. You can reach Dr. Sharon at her website, drsharongrossman.com, and I'll include a link in the show notes. Welcome, Sharon. I'm so glad that you could join with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Linda.
I am delighted. And I want to congratulate you on another best-selling book. The latest one is The Stress Advantage. And there's one line that caught my attention. It said, "It's not about wrestling stress to the ground. It's about learning to dance with it." And that's a very different approach. So can we talk about how stress is an advantage and how we can dance with it?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So I think that we all have this very negative connotation to stress. And I think it's important that we learn to change our relationship to it because just like with anything else, it has its upsides and it has its downsides. And I would say primarily when it comes to the downsides, even though we all know this, I think it's important to say it, it's when we're not feeling like we have control, when we feel like it's something very negative, and when it is either chronic, which then turns into burnout, or it's something that is so debilitating or traumatic that it can be a very acute stressor, but it really puts us out. So I would say, while those things are true, I think the other side of the coin is the side that we don't talk about enough. And that's where stress can actually be enhancing. And I think the really the reason why I wrote this book is to highlight the other side of this coin. Because when we recognize that we have a choice in this relationship with stress, that it's empowering, that we might make different decisions, that we may not become stressed about being stressed, which I think often adds a whole other layer to it. So in answer to your question, there are a number of ways that we can look at stress in a positive, from as like a point of advantage. And I talk in this book about three different ways. The first is really this idea of turning these threats into opportunities. So our brain is kind of wired to look for everything that's going wrong, for all the threats, as we call it. And you'll notice that if you're kind of getting into this fight or flight mode, because everything seems like a potential disaster waiting to happen. There are people that have a lot of anxiety who live in this mode constantly, right? And it's important to recognize that a lot of the things that we perceive to be as threats it's just a story. It's really just our interpretation. And in almost every situation, you can find the upside. You can find how maybe it's not really as bad. Now, I typically, when I'm speaking to audiences, I'll ask, have you ever been in a situation that at the time felt like it was definitely something you didn't want to experience? Something that felt really negative, and you were maybe even feeling sorry for yourself about. But now in retrospect, you can look back and say, that was game changing for me. my life is now better and different because of this thing that happened. Right. And I think pretty much everybody raises their hand to this. And that's the thing is when things are happening in the moment, we just know that it's not what we want because the way that our brain is wired is we are always seeking pleasure and trying to avoid pain. So it makes sense. We don't even know where this thing is going to take us yet. So I think there's definitely an opportunity to be able to look at whatever's going on in your life and say to yourself exactly that. I don't know what the upside is for the situation yet, but I know that there's something, right? And I think it's really just training your brain to look for those opportunities. I think that there are so many ways of looking at the same situation, and often we think that we have to wait for the situation to change in order for us to feel happy or to feel the way that we want to feel. But the truth is that we have an opportunity in every moment to make a different decision. And it's really about asking yourself these really powerful questions that can help you reframe the things that seem negative and threatening to something that maybe is a challenge or an opportunity. You can think about if it's something that's already happened, you can think about what did I learn from that situation? How is that making me better, stronger, wiser? If it's something that's happening in the moment, you may not know the answer to that, but you, as I said, can maybe recognize that it's coming and kind of being on the lookout for it, as opposed to the way that we typically operate as we're on the lookout for the negative thing that hasn't yet happened, right? So often when I'll talk to my clients, I'll say, well, I don't really allow myself to experience joy because I worry that as soon as that happens, then the other shoe's going to drop. So they're always kind of anticipating the negative and not allowing themselves to experience the positive. And I'm saying, what if we flip that? Right? We're so aware of all the negative things. We don't really need to practice that. What if we actually focused on what we want and anticipating that and saying like, oh, I'm going to look for that in every corner and see like, what is the opportunity? What is the positive thing that came out of this?
Wow, that is such an awesome way to look at things. And there are a couple words that just stuck out to me. One of them is our relationship with stress, changing the way that we interact. And you're so right. The default setting for most people with stress is bad. I need to eliminate it or deal with it or get through it. This is ruining my life. And to change that relationship and to look for the positives, then when stress happens, I don't need to immediately freak out. Like you said, I don't need to stress about being stressed. And the other word that I just loved was when you talked about it as a story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, are the stories that we tell ourselves are so much more real than what's going on around us. And so if we can manipulate the story so that it creates something that is beautiful and wonderful rather than miserable, when you're describing clients who don't dare experience joy, because the moment you have joy, the other shoe will drop. What a miserable existence where you can't even allow yourself to have joy in those moments where we could be experiencing joy. What a sad thing. I think, okay, let's not beat ourselves up for whatever we've done in the past, but from right here, right now, let's look at things a little different. See if we can come up with a new story and a new relationship with stress so that it's not horrible. Well, sometimes stress is horrible, but whatever positives we can come up with it, is this an opportunity for growth? Is this something that is going to make me better, stronger, more capable, have that deeper understanding, maybe more compassionate? This is a whole different take. This is indeed a dance and not necessarily a wrestle. And I loved, you said that there were 3 things that we could do. Rats to opportunities.
So that's really the first technique or strategy. So if you are somebody who gets overwhelmed by everything that's stressing you out, that's just one thing that you can do. And when you do that, it really turns stress into something that becomes your advantage. Because if everything that happens is an opportunity, whether it's you learn something from it, it's made you more resilient because you've overcome it, whatever the case might be, then you don't have to become so stressed about it as it's happening. You can kind of be like, okay, well, this is something that I'm going through right now, and it's not going to last forever. And on the other side of it, there's something really positive waiting for me. Right. And I think that we're very capable of doing this kind of work. I mean, when I talk to some of my clients and they talk about how they've always pushed themselves as if they're running this marathon. And they said, when I get to a certain age, that's when I'm going to retire. And at that point, then everything is going to be great. Then I'll be able to feel happy. And then I'll be able to do all the things that I love. But right now, like, I just have to focus on doing the work that I'm doing. And actually, that's a pretty miserable experience because it's all work and no play. And what I'm here to say is that you can do all of these things simultaneously. You don't have to wait for that finish line, because what happens is if you live your whole life like that, you get to that finish line and then you realize, I don't even know how to play at this point. Like, it's such a foreign language. And if I change out of this work mode into play mode, then it's producing anxiety because it's unfamiliar and I don't even know like who I am if I'm not at work, because that's been my whole identity. So I'm saying, what if we can integrate the two? What if we can just embrace that there's going to be things that are stressful, and those things are sometimes things that if we can catch ourselves in the moment, if we can slow down enough to ask ourselves some powerful questions, we can turn those negative experiences into at least something that is neutral, if not positive.
Love it. And I know it's so common for people to say, I will be happy when.
Yes.
I will do this when. We postpone our happiness to some future time. My husband is an airline pilot, and he had a jump seater. So another pilot from another company was sitting up with him, and he was so excited. And he said, I am about to retire. And now I'm about to have the good life. And my husband looked at him, and he was old, and he was wrinkled, and he was bald, and he had age spots. And he thought, wow, so you've been waiting, and now the good life is about to start. And he said that affected him so much. He said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to wait until I retire to have a good life. I'm going to have joy in the journey. Yes. And I love how you talk about play. I'm sure everyone has friends and associates, I know I do, who don't know how to play. Like you said, it gives that feeling of anxiety because I should be doing something. And it might be, I should be doing something of value, or I should be progressing, or I should be, and there's a whole lot of shoulds that destroy any opportunity to play now. So that integration of finding a balance of, I'm going to do good things. I am going to work. I am going to progress. And I am going to experience joy now. Are there some things? So say you have this client who's come in and is feeling that I need to wait until I retire. I need to wait until I reach this goal that I've set for myself before I can have joy. What are some steps to help them recognize and give themselves permission, really? Because from some of my friends, I feel like they don't give themselves permission. There's guilt if they try to pause and enjoy something now.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with your beliefs about yourself. And what I find is I call these people who have their self-worth kind of wrapped up in their productivity, I call them doers. And that's one of my 3 burnout profiles. And so for me, it's really about doing that work where you're working on your relationship with yourself, where you can see that you are worthy without having to accomplish another thing. You don't need to, as you said, always be achieving something or providing something of value. Yes, you may have done that your whole life, and that's fantastic. But you have more than one mode, and you have permission to have more than one mode. So if you're listening to this and you've been operating in this way, and you're like that co-pilot that that you just heard about from Linda, this may be your wake up call to start doing it differently, to ask yourself some powerful questions, to change how you operate in the world, because you don't want to be that person who gets to the finish line all wrinkled and bald with the spots and all these things and then says, okay, now I'm going to start my life. Like, no, you have the opportunity to do that now. So why wait? And I think sometimes it just means that you have to shift the identity, of being the producer, being the achiever, to being a person who likes to play, who likes to do things for fun, even though they may not produce anything. And that's okay, right? Like, we don't always have to be in work mode. So just giving yourself permission to do both, and rather than just one and then wait for the other in like 30 years from now.
And when you say it out loud, doesn't it sound a little bit silly? I will be happy in just 30, 40 years,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
I
In your
think that would be a
head, it
great
makes perfect
exercise.
sense.
I think that's one way to get people to actually realize what they're doing and see how preposterous it actually is. Because if you say it out loud, you're going to be like, that doesn't even make sense. Why would I do that? But we're so programmed in this culture to just be on all the time. And we have all these goals for our career and our finances and everything else that sometimes we put everything else on hold. And let me tell you something, there are people that never get to that finish line. There, there's just people that don't make it, right? You don't have a guarantee that you're going to live another 30 years. So you're going to wait to see if maybe after you've worked all these years so hard that you'll get a chance to play like that. There's no guarantee you're going to make it. So why wouldn't you squeeze what you can out of life now? That's how I like to think about it. In my kids' school, there was this woman that worked there in the administration office, and she'd been there for years and years. And then she retired. And like 2 months after she retired, the woman dropped dead. And I'm like, none of us obviously want that to happen to us, but you just never know. And sometimes I think the person drops dead because their whole life was their work, and there's like no sense of purpose anymore, that they just, they just don't know what to do with themselves, and it just catches up with you. Or maybe it's just like all the stress that's accumulated over the years. If you haven't managed it well, it just catches up with you, and then you get a heart attack or something. So the point is not to put these things on hold. The point is to figure out how to change your relationship to stress, to incorporate joy now rather than waiting for some future date, and recognize that you have a lot more control than you ever realized. You have options available to you, and it's really you that's getting in the way.
Wow. And that is so key, because it comes back to us. And I loved you also mentioned that relationship with self. How do I define my self-worth? If my self-worth is defined in my doing, say my to-do list or my goals or my whatever, then if I pause for a moment, then it might feel like, well, I have no worth while I'm pausing. And that can be a very scary thing. I had a friend who said there's a difference between self-esteem and self-love. Self-esteem is knowing that you have talents and skills to bring to the table. Self-love means you have value when you are doing nothing.
I love
And
that.
to be able to have both of those is so important, because like you mentioned, if our self-worth is wrapped around our doing, and you said that is a burnout profile, but if that's the way that I'm functioning, and that is the only way that I have value, then I'm really scared to stop.
Yeah.
So I would love to talk about the difference between, burnout and just, feeling tired. What kinds of things? What's the distinguishing factors between those?
That's a really good question. So one of the flagship symptoms of burnout is exhaustion. And we typically think about it not just like as a physical exhaustion, like you just ran a marathon, but more so as a mental or emotional exhaustion. And you know the difference between, being totally exhausted and just being tired. It's this unrelenting exhaustion that maybe it's not enough for you to take the weekend to rest because 2 days have passed, you haven't been working, and you're still exhausted on Monday. That's what we're talking about, right? It requires more of you to get back to yourself. And sometimes it's months. It just depends like how far along the spectrum of burnout you've gone. We talk about burnout like it's one thing, but it's not. It's on a spectrum. There are people who are lightly burned out, and then there's people that are totally fried, and you can be anywhere in the middle. And it just depends like how long you've been putting your needs on hold, how long you've been dealing with stress in an unhelpful way, how stressful your situation is, how many stressors you're dealing with at any one time. And there's so many things that contribute to burnout that I always like to say burnout is not a one size fits all problem, and it doesn't require a one size fits all solution. So you really have to understand what led you there so that you can find your way back. And that's really what I talk about on my podcast, Decode Your Burnout, where I've got these 3 burnout profiles to help people really find themselves in that burnout story, to figure out like not just what is so obvious, like, oh, I work in a toxic environment, or I'm really stressed out because in addition to all the work that I do in the office, I'm also a mom of 3 kids, or I've got a child with a disability, or I'm a single parent, or I have an elderly parent that I'm taking care of, or I've got a cancer diagnosis. I mean, there's so many things in life that are additional stressors. And when you put them all together, it's no wonder we're feeling as exhausted as we are, right? What I'm here to do is to really help people figure out how to change that relationship to stress. And we've talked already about one way to do it. And there's other ways as well. It's really about, first and foremost, understanding that stress doesn't have to be a bad thing. I always like to say stress is not the enemy. It's about figuring out how to turn stress into your superpower. And when we're using these techniques that I'm talking about, like turning threats into opportunities, something seemingly bad might happen and you might come out stronger because of it. And if you have that sort of vantage point, if you're looking at it from that perspective, it's not going to bring you down. It's not going to negatively affect you in the same way. So it's really about these mindset shifts that allow you to turn these things around and have it work for you rather than against you. So we've talked about the threats into opportunities, and I'll just share a couple of more strategies for those who are curious. One of the things that I know happens is when we're stressed out or we're like in an anxiety state, we often feel the physiological symptoms of that. So like our heart might be racing. Like think about when you're about to go do public speaking. If you're not somebody who's into public speaking, which is the majority of people, a lot of people are like, that is the scariest thing I could ever imagine putting myself through, right? So imagine yourself now standing in front of an audience and your heart's beating and maybe you're sweating and you're shaking. Like these are all physiological symptoms of arousal. And on some level, this is what we experience when we're under tremendous amounts of stress or anxiety. And one of the things that I like to say is that when you experience these symptoms, sometimes it comes along with a story. Like I feel my heart beating faster, and I interpret that to mean that I'm in danger. I interpret because we get into this fight or flight mode. So I interpret that to be a sign of something going wrong. What if you interpreted those symptoms as my body is energizing me to face this challenge, right? I'm about to go and deliver a speech in front of a group of people. I'm feeling my heart beat faster, and it's really producing all of this adrenaline and energy so that I can be on top of my game when I'm in front of these people, right? So it's really about, a lot of times it's about the explanation, it's about the interpretation, it's how we craft a story around what's happening. And sometimes this happens on an unconscious level. We don't even realize that we're making these split-second decisions about what things mean. But this is, again, an opportunity to slow down and then notice what you're experiencing and then find a story that elevates you rather than brings you down, right? So instead of saying, oh my God, I'm going to screw this up. I'm feeling all this anxiety. I can't breathe. Oh no, I'm going to forget everything I'm supposed to say. Then yeah, you're probably going to forget everything you're supposed to say because you're kind of working yourself up into this frenzy. What if you said to yourself, I know this stuff by heart. This is what I do for a living. And I might feel a little bit more energized in this moment than I normally would. But how can I use that? How can I use that energy? Maybe it'll make me more engaging with the audience. Maybe I can channel that, right? So I'm always thinking about, like, how can you channel the energy to work for you? How can you think about it? Maybe it's about excitement. Maybe it's about determination, right? How can you flip it into something that's positive, that's going to serve you?
It is absolutely brilliant. And I love that you're describing it in the terms of a story. Again, the stories that we tell ourselves. And I've been wondering and almost waiting if you were going to bring in the Yerkes-Dodson curve, that over 100 years ago, researchers started recognizing that this stress or this arousal really does improve our performance. And it creates a bell curve. So it increases us, helps us to function better, that it is our friend. It helps us to be able to have more clarity of thought. It gives us that energy to be able to do things up until we get to the point. And then if it's too much, then we absolutely and completely fall apart. And so if our stories are not recognizing that, hey, this thing is part of my natural physiology that's trying to help me to improve my performance, all I see it is the enemy, that it's trying to destroy me. I have just self-sabotaged. And then this thing, instead of being my friend, I go right to the part where it destroys me and I fall off the cliff and I am a disaster and I can't speak and I can't remember anything, and all of these kinds of situations. So I love that you're phrasing it in the terms of stories, because that is easy to understand. It's easier to understand than saying, oh, here's the research that shows XYZ. It's pay attention. What are you telling yourself? How does this match?
Yeah, and it just made me think about Tony Robbins, who is, I think somebody most people know of, a sensational motivational speaker. What he does before he goes on stage is he actually purposely elevates his heartbeat by jumping up on a trampoline, right? So he actually gets himself into that state and he uses the energy to get up on stage and be like, rah, 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 right? To motivate people and to be like super energized. So if he's doing that on purpose and channeling it, then we can do it when it's happening without our consent, if you will, where it's just kind of like our body goes into that mode and say, okay, this is like my trampoline. I'm like that Tony Robbins. I'm going to use this. I'm going to, channel it. So I think just having these concepts in your mind as something that's available to you is really helpful.
I agree. Absolutely. That it can be our friend and that someone does it on purpose, where it's the physical aspect of it, not the mental freak out that most of us start with. It's, let me do that same thing using that bouncing on this trampoline so that I can gather that energy and to think, wow, my body is trying to do that for me all by itself.
Yes.
When I stand up to speak and my heart is racing and I can feel those butterflies, it's trying to help me. What a totally and completely different perspective that is. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Sharon, this has been amazing. Is there anything else you want to make sure that we cover before we close today?
Yeah, so I promised you 3 techniques and I've shared 2. So I'm going to quickly just share the third, which is when you feel stressed about something, it means that you care. Because if you think about it, if there's something that happens and you don't feel stressed out about it, it's because you don't really care about it, right? So I think about, like, if you see somebody getting into an accident, but it's not like somebody that it's not going to feel as stressful because it's like, oh, like, or you hear something happen in the news, you're like, oh, that sucks, but I'm not like all stressed out about it, right? But if it's like your loved one, you would be in a completely different state. Why? It's the same thing, right? It's like two people in an accident. What's the difference? Well, it's because you care about your loved one. It's closer to home. So think about stress as a sign that something matters to you. And then I think it's an opportunity to kind of zoom out and ask yourself, like if it's happening at work, ask yourself, what is the purpose? Why am I doing this work? Right? So it's kind of like an opportunity to get out of the weeds for a moment, because we get stressed out when we're in the weeds, right? We're like, oh my God, overwhelmed city. So zoom out and ask yourself, what is the purpose of this work? Why am I doing this in the first place? And I think that gives you this opportunity to see that there is a sense of purpose, that you care about what's happening. And it kind of helps you to understand, like, why am I putting myself through this thing? And it's just a reminder. It's just a reminder that you're there for the right reason, but you maybe got lost along the way. So it's just like a way to remind yourself to bring yourself back to the mission, to like what is the actual point of being in the situation in the first place, right? If your loved one is injured, as I said in the beginning, as part of that example, yeah, you're stressed out because you care about that person. So think about, how can I work on that relationship? How can I help that person? Like channel the stress into something positive, into something that aligns with your purpose. And that's really like the third technique that I want to share with people, as a way of using this as something to your advantage, as opposed to, when you don't do this, you can just become, stress is debilitating, and then you freeze and you're not very hopeful, and you're not really doing anything that is aligned with your purpose. You're just kind of like watching it and feeling helpless and maybe getting depressed or feeling anxious. That's not really helpful. So this is about training yourself to think differently so that you can feel differently and then behave differently.
I like all of those things. And as you were describing that specific example of seeing an accident, and whether it's someone that you care about or it's just that annoying traffic jam, my mind immediately went to a situation where I arrived at the scene of an accident in time to see my son, who had just been in a motorcycle accident, in the middle of the intersection, surrounded by flashing lights. And I just have to say that stress, and it's because I care. I mean, anyway, your example just really hit home, and it brought back a memory to me. And that actually changed the way I look at accidents now. Rather than being as upset that there's a delay on my commute, I think, oh, that's somebody that, somebody cares about, who's in hurt or who needs help. So anyway, thank you. As we change the way we see things and recognize that these things are about caring. And if we can turn that from fear into love, to me, care is love. And so if we can switch things around, and I appreciate you giving us some of the tools so that we can do that. I really appreciate you, Sharon. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
In closing, I'd like to share a quote by Bansky. If you get tired, learn to rest, not to quit. If you're feeling overwhelmed, exhausted, or burned out, I invite you to learn to take a rest, take a break, and do something for yourself. See you next time on Linda's Corner.
Thanks for listening. Please share and subscribe to help us reach new listeners. And if you'd like to heal your life from the inside out, there is a free video series at hopeforhealingfoundation.org. Just click on the free stuff tab. I also invite you to grab a copy of one of my books, like Crushed, A Journey Through Depression, and You Got This, an action plan to calm fear, anxiety, worry, and stress. See you next time on Linda's Corner.